The crack of distant thunder rumbled over the forest as Gideon Voss trudged through the thick underbrush, rifle slung over his shoulder. A seasoned hunter and ex-soldier, he moved silently through the towering pines, his senses sharp despite the years that had worn him down. Solitude was his refuge, and out here, far from the decaying remnants of human civilization, he could pretend the wars and losses were distant memories. He adjusted the worn strap on his rifle, eyes narrowing as he spotted fresh tracks. Deer, likely. His fingers brushed the cold metal of his weapon out of habit. The wind stirred the trees, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp leaves and something off, metallic, burnt. Before he could investigate further, the sky split open with a deafening boom. A streak of white-hot fire tore across the heavens, leaving a fiery trail that seared the dark clouds. Gideon flinched, instinctively dropping into a defensive crouch as the burning object plummeted toward the eastern ridge. Moments later, the ground quaked beneath his boots as a distant explosion shattered the stillness. Birds erupted into the sky, screeching in terror. His pulse quickened. He hadn't seen a crash like that since the war, when alien ships fell from the sky like cursed stars. Old instincts flared to life. Without another thought, he set off toward the ridge, rifle gripped tightly in his calloused hands. The journey was rough. The forest thickened, branches clawing at his jacket, but Gideon moved with practiced ease. He crested the ridge just as the first drops of rain began to fall, steam hissing off twisted metal debris scattered across the clearing below. Smoke billowed from the shattered remnants of what could only be a small alien transport ship, its hull still glowing with residual heat. His eyes scanned the wreckage cautiously. No movement. No bodies. A sudden flash of movement caught his attention. His grip on the rifle tightened as two figures emerged from the fractured ship, staggering but upright. They weren't soldiers, or at least not in any uniform he recognized. The first woman was tall and lithe, her shimmering skin catching the firelight like molten silver. Her long, dark hair was streaked with glowing filaments that pulsed faintly as if reacting to her emotions. Her intense gaze swept across the clearing with sharp, predatory awareness. She moved like a fighter, a dangerous one. The second woman followed closely behind, her presence softer but no less striking. Her skin had a soft iridescence, and her eyes were deep and knowing, almost haunting. She touched the first woman's arm briefly, a silent exchange passing between them. Allies or more. Gideon held his breath, weighing his options. He could retreat. This wasn't his fight. But something about their weary, hunted expressions stopped him. They were running from something. Before he could decide, a new sound sliced through the rain-soaked air. The harsh mechanical whir of approaching hovercraft engines. The stomach clenched. Bounty hunters. He could tell from the familiar, menacing hum of their crafts. The alien women heard it too. The fierce one, the fighter, snarled a curse in a language he couldn't understand and reached for a weapon strapped to her thigh. The empath-like woman touched her shoulder again, urging caution, but it was clear they were both preparing for a last stand. Gideon cursed under his breath. He should have walked away, let fate take its course. But he couldn't shake the memory of those hunted looks, worn like scars. He raised his rifle, took a deep breath and stepped out from the tree line. "Get down," he barked. The women spun toward him, the fighter already raising her weapon, eyes blazing with defiance. For a split second, Gideon thought she might shoot him, but something in his tone, or perhaps his rugged, battle-worn appearance, made her hesitate. The first bounty hunter hovercraft burst into the clearing, searchlights sweeping the wreckage. Gideon didn't wait. He dropped to one knee, sighted down his rifle, and fired. The lead hunter crumpled as the shot hit home. Chaos erupted. The fighter woman sprang into action, her alien weapon flashing with arcs of electric light. She moved with deadly precision, her attacks fluid and savage. The empath used strange, resonant vibrations from her hands to disorient and disable enemies, driving them back. Gideon found himself fighting alongside them, covering blind spots, his old soldier's instincts kicking in with practiced efficiency. Despite their clear differences, They moved as if they'd fought together for years. When the last bounty hunter fell, silence returned, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the patter of rain on leaves. Smoke curled lazily from the shattered hovercrafts, their flickering lights slowly fading into darkness. Gideon lowered his rifle, breathing hard. He turned to face the women, unsure what to expect. The fighter still held her weapon loosely at her side. Her piercing gaze locked on him with suspicion and something more. Curiosity, perhaps. The empath regarded him with quiet intensity, as if seeing far deeper than he was comfortable with. "You saved us?" the empath finally said, her voice low and melodic, tinged with disbelief. "Don't thank me yet," Gideon muttered. "They'll send more." The fighter stepped forward, close enough that he could see the faint glow tracing patterns beneath her skin like living tattoos. Her expression softened, just a fraction. "Why help us?" she demanded, her voice sharp but not unkind. Gideon met her gaze steadily. "Didn't seem right to let you die," he said simply. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then, without warning, the fighter extended her hand, a gesture as wary as it was begrudging. "Lyra," she said reluctantly. "And this is Arindra." He hesitated, then clasped her hand, feeling its strange, electric warmth against his calloused palm. "Gideon," he replied gruffly. Before he could pull away, Arindra stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with something he couldn't quite name. Her fingers brushed his wrist, light but deliberate. Her touch lingered, intimate, searching, as if trying to feel beyond the surface. "You're not what I expected," she murmured, voice almost reverent. "Neither are you," Gideon thought but kept it to himself. The rain fell harder now, masking the distant sounds of more approaching craft. Their fragile alliance had just begun, but trust would be far harder to win. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the worn wooden walls of Gideon's homestead. Rain pounded relentlessly outside, drumming against the roof in steady rhythm. The air inside was thick with the mingled scents of smoke, damp clothing, and something faintly floral, an alien fragrance that clung to Lyra and Arindra, stirring memories Gideon couldn't place. He stood near the fire, arms crossed, his sharp eyes tracking every movement as the two alien women explored the room with wary precision. His homestead was simple, sturdy wooden beams, rough-hewn furniture, and shelves lined with tools and scavenged relics from a world long past. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. Lyra paced the length of the room, restless and tense. She examined the barred windows and bolted doors, her fingers brushing the hilt of her curved blade with habitual familiarity. Her luminous skin still held a faint glow from the earlier fight, shimmering faintly like the dying embers in the hearth. Arindra stood quietly near the fire, her hands outstretched toward the warmth as though absorbing it through her delicate fingertips. Her expression was serene, but her eyes gleamed with quiet intensity, watching Gideon as much as she watched the storm outside. "You can stop casing the place," Gideon muttered. "If I wanted you dead, I'd have done it back in the forest." Lyra's sharp gaze snapped toward him. "Trust is earned, human," she said coldly. Her voice had a low, cutting edge, dangerous but undeniably compelling. "I'm not asking for trust," Gideon shot back, meeting her glare without flinching. "Just don't break anything." For a moment, tension crackled between them, sharp and electric. Then Arindra's soft voice cut through the air like silk. "He saved our lives, Lyra. We owe him at least caution, if not gratitude." Lyra's jaw tightened, but she gave a curt nod, retreating to lean against the far wall, her arms folded. She watched Gideon like a predator sizing up a potential threat, or perhaps something far more complicated. Gideon exhaled slowly and moved toward the kitchen alcove. He pulled a battered metal kettle from a shelf and filled it with water from a rust-stained jug, setting it over the fire. The familiar motion steadied him, though he remained acutely aware of the two alien women occupying his space. Strange, dangerous, and undeniably compelling presences. He cleared his throat. "You have names. I figure that means you've got a reason for being here. Earth isn't exactly a popular vacation spot." Lyra scoffed bitterly. Vacation? This planet's a wasteland. We were exiled, Iringer said softly, folding her hands in front of her. Punished for defying orders. Her voice held a note of sadness, but also defiance. We are fugitives now. There is no home to return to. Noting the way her shoulders tensed despite her calm facade. What kind of orders? Iringer hesitated, but Lyra answered first, her voice low and bitter. Orders to be something we're not. Gideon didn't press further. He'd seen enough of war and broken promises to recognize when someone was running from something far worse than they could explain. The kettle hissed as steam rose from its spout. He poured the hot water into 3 mismatched cups, sliding one toward each of them without a word. Lyra sniffed the drink suspiciously, while Irindra accepted hers with a quiet nod of thanks. Why help us? Irindra asked softly, cradling the warm cup in her hands. Her gaze held his steady and searching. You risked your life back there. Gideon shrugged, uncomfortable under her piercing stare. Didn't seem right to let you die. He paused, then added gruffly. Besides, those bounty hunters were trespassing on my land. Lyra smirked faintly at that, though she quickly hid it behind her cup. Practical at least, she muttered. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not entirely hostile. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling through the distant trees like a mournful cry. Gideon moved to stoke the fire, feeding another log into the flames. As he straightened, he felt a presence at his side. Iringer stood close, closer than he'd expected, her soft eyes gleaming with curiosity and something deeper, more intense. You carry such weight, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingertips brushed the worn leather of his jacket, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through him. Pain, loss. It clings to you like a shadow. Gideon stiffened, resisting the urge to pull away. You're reading me, he said warily. I can't help it. Her touch lingered, warm and searching, as though she were tracing something far beneath the surface. You feel different, steady, but scarred. He stepped back, breaking the contact, though her touch lingered like a whispered memory against his skin. I'm fine, he muttered. Iringer's gaze remained steady, unshaken by his retreat. You hide well, but not from me. Before he could respond, Lyra pushed off the wall with sudden intensity. We shouldn't stay here, she said sharply, pacing the room again. The bounty hunters will be back, and next time, they won't be careless. Gideon nodded grimly. She was right. His homestead, sturdy though it was, wouldn't withstand another assault. They needed a plan, and fast. There's an old starship buried near the eastern ridge, he said reluctantly. It's damaged, but if we can repair it, we might have a way out. Lyra's eyes lit with fierce determination. Then we fix it. Iringer glanced between them, her expression unreadable but resolute. Together, despite himself, Gideon felt something stir deep inside. A flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. He pushed it down. Survival came first. Everything else could wait. The first rays of dawn cut through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain as Gideon led Lyra and Irindra toward the old starship. His every step was practiced and steady, honed by years of navigating Earth's unforgiving wilderness. The scent of damp earth lingered in the cool morning air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of long-abandoned machinery buried deep in the forest. He glanced back to ensure they were keeping up. Lyra moved like a restless shadow, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for threats. Irindra followed more quietly, her steps lighter, almost serene, though there was no mistaking the watchful intelligence behind her calm expression. It's just up ahead, Gideon grunted, motioning toward a rocky outcrop partially obscured by thick vines and tangled roots. Been there since the war. Don't know how much of it still works. Lyra's gaze narrowed. Why keep something like that hidden? Didn't trust anyone not to come sniffing around, he replied. Figured it might be useful someday. He paused, adding with grim amusement. Guess that day's today. They pushed through the undergrowth, revealing the battered remains of a long-forgotten starship half buried in the earth. The hull was scorched and fractured, its outer plating rusted but still sturdy in places. The ship's skeletal frame jutted from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast, defiant even in decay. Arindra's breath caught softly. It's still intact. Enough to be worth a shot, Gideon said. If we can get the core running and patch the navigation systems, it might just fly. Lyra was already moving, running her hands along the fractured hull with a critical eye. Weapons? Stripped long ago, Gideon admitted. We'll have to rely on speed, not firepower. Her lips pressed into a hard line, but she nodded. Then let's get to work. They set to the grim task of clearing debris and assessing the damage. Gideon pried open a rusted maintenance hatch, the hinges groaning in protest. He dropped inside, landing in the dimly lit interior where the air was thick with the scent of oil and old metal. Flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the narrow corridors. Lyra followed with practiced ease, while Arindra lingered at the entrance, her gaze distant, as though sensing something unseen. See anything useful? Gideon called out as he began testing dormant systems. Not yet, Lyra replied tersely, already dismantling a corroded panel. Her skilled hands moved with practiced precision, muscles flexing beneath her strange, shimmering skin. Despite himself, Gideon found his gaze lingering for a moment longer than he intended. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Arindra stepped inside, her fingertips grazing the ship's cold walls as though feeling its long-dead pulse. Her expression softened with something almost like reverence. "This ship remembers," she whispered, voice tinged with quiet wonder. Gideon frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She met his gaze, her luminous eyes steady. "It still holds echoes of those who were here before, their struggles, their hopes." Her fingers brushed a nearby console, her touch light but deliberate. "It wants to fly again," Lyra snorted. "Machines don't want anything." "Maybe not to you," Arindra said softly, her gaze never wavering. "But I can feel it." There was no arguing with that kind of conviction. Gideon returned his focus to the navigation system, prying open a damaged control panel. Sparks flickered faintly as he tested the wiring, but the system remained stubbornly dead. "Power's still out," he muttered. "We'll need to bypass the reactor's failsafe, assuming it hasn't corroded into dust." "I'll handle the core," Lyra said, already heading deeper into the ship. Left alone, Gideon worked in silence, his hands moving with practiced precision. The quiet was broken only by the distant hum of wind outside and the faint sound of Arindra's steps as she moved through the dimly lit corridor behind him. "You're good at this," she observed softly, her voice like a distant melody. "Had to be," he replied without looking up. "You don't survive long out here without knowing how to fix what's broken." A long pause stretched between them before she spoke again, her tone softer. "What about things that can't be fixed?" Gideon hesitated, his hands stilling against the worn metal. "You do what you can, or you move on." Arindra stepped closer, her presence warm despite the cold steel surrounding them. "Have you moved on, Gideon?" she asked quietly. He looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes searched his with an intensity that left him unguarded. Before he could answer, she reached out, her fingers grazing the back of his hand. A touch light as silk but charged with something far deeper. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. Her fingertips traced along the rough lines of his knuckles, exploring the worn, battle-hardened edges like reading a map of forgotten stories. "You carry so much," she whispered. "So much you won't let go." Gideon swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at him to pull away, but he couldn't. Her touch was grounding, warm and unyielding, cutting through the iron walls he'd built around himself. Before he could respond, a distant clang echoed through the ship, a sharp, metallic sound that shattered the fragile stillness. Gideon jerked back, reaching for his sidearm. "Lyra," he barked, already moving toward the sound. Arendra followed, her expression tense but composed. As they approached the ship's core chamber, the dim emergency lights flickered uncertainly, casting eerie shadows across the twisted machinery. Lyra stood near the reactor's central console, her weapon drawn, eyes blazing with fierce determination. She didn't lower it when she saw them. "We've got company," she hissed. Gideon's stomach clenched as the distant sound of grinding metal echoed through the ship's hollow corridors. Something or someone was coming. Their fragile moment was gone, replaced by the cold, unyielding reality of survival. The metallic echoes grew louder, reverberating through the starship's hollow corridors like a drumbeat of approaching doom. Gideon crouched low behind a shattered bulkhead, his sidearm gripped tight in calloused hands. Lyra stood across from him, her blade gleaming faintly in the dim emergency lighting, eyes sharp and unyielding. Arendra knelt behind a rusted console, her fingers tracing faint patterns into the dusty metal as if grounding herself through touch. Light as breath. The touch sent a pulse of warmth through him, not just physical, but something deeper, resonant, electric. He felt her energy stirring like a distant psalm, ancient and powerful. Before he could question her, she closed her eyes, focusing entirely on the connection between them. A gentle hum filled the air, vibrating faintly through the walls, growing in intensity as her power flowed outward. Gideon's breath hitched as he felt her presence intertwine with his, slipping past his defenses like water through cracks in stone. His memories stirred, painful, buried things he'd long locked away. But Arendra didn't push. She simply was, steady and unwavering, anchoring him even as she drew strength from the raw, unspoken emotions he carried. The ship's hull shimmered faintly, glowing with an otherworldly light as her power wrapped around them like a protective cocoon. The next missile struck, but instead of tearing through the ship, it shattered harmlessly against the barrier she'd created. "Holy!" Gideon gasped, wide-eyed. Arendra exhaled slowly, visibly drained but still standing, her fingertips lingering against his arm. "I told you. Trust me." Before he could respond, Lyra's triumphant voice crackled through the intercom. "Weapons are live, returning fire." The starship's ancient cannons roared to life, sending blazing arcs of plasma toward the pursuing ships. One enemy vessel exploded in a dazzling burst of flame and twisted metal, vanishing into the storm below. The comm went dead, replaced by silence, tense, electric, and full of possibility. Breathing hard, Gideon slowly released the controls, allowing the ship to stabilize. His pulse still thundered in his ears, but his hands felt steadier than they had in years. Arendra sagged slightly, her strength clearly spent. He caught her before she could fall, steadying her with firm, calloused hands. Her skin felt impossibly warm against his, her breath soft and shallow. "You shouldn't have done that," he murmured, his voice rough with concern. She managed a faint, tired smile. "You needed help." Their eyes met, the air between them charged with something fragile and undeniable. His hand lingered against her waist, warm and steady, grounding them both in the aftermath of survival. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Gideon felt something stir deep within him. Something beyond duty or survival, something that felt dangerously close to hope. But the moment couldn't last. The distant hum of approaching ships echoed faintly through the storm. "We're not out of this yet," he muttered, reluctantly releasing her. Arendra straightened with quiet determination, her exhaustion hidden behind steady resolve. "Then we keep fighting," she said softly. And for the first time, Gideon believed they just might stand a chance. The cold metal of the starship's deck hummed faintly beneath Gideon's boots as he paced the bridge, his mind racing. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving behind a turbulent sky streaked with faint light from a distant star. The respite was temporary, he knew. The bounty hunters wouldn't retreat, not after losing 2 ships. They were regrouping, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. He cast a glance toward the navigation console where Arendra worked tirelessly, her fingers gliding over the flickering controls like a painter shaping something unseen. Despite her earlier exhaustion, she moved with precise focus, her glowing skin still faintly illuminated, though dimmer now. The protective barrier she'd conjured had cost her more than she'd let on. From the comm panel, Lyra's voice crackled through, sharp and efficient. Reactor stabilizing, but shields are still offline. We can't take another hit like that. Gideon's jaw clenched. What about the jump drive? Still dead, Lyra snapped. Unless you've got another miracle tucked away, we're sitting ducks. He muttered a curse under his breath, turning back toward the viewport. The barren horizon stretched endlessly below, offering no cover, no salvation. His mind worked through scenarios, calculating odds that shrank with every passing second. A soft presence brushed against his arm, warm, steady. He turned to find Arindra standing close, her eyes searching his with quiet intensity. Her gaze was both calming and resolute, an anchor against the storm raging inside him. "You're thinking like you're still alone," she said gently. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Old habit. You're not alone now," she whispered. Before he could respond, a sharp alarm blared through the bridge. The proximity sensor flashed an angry red, and the main display lit up with hostile signatures. 3 ships closing in fast. "They're coming back," Gideon growled, instinctively tightening his grip on the control yoke. "Weapons status? Operational, barely," Lyra reported. "But if we take them head-on, we're finished." A tense silence settled over the bridge as the reality of their situation sank in. They couldn't win, not through brute force. The enemy was better equipped, better armed, and far more numerous. Arindra's voice cut through the tension like a quiet flame. "What if we don't fight?" Both Gideon and Lyra turned toward her, frowning. "They expect resistance," Arindra continued, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We can't overpower them, but we can outthink them." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "A feint," she said. "If we make it look like we're abandoning the ship, they'll come aboard. They won't risk destroying us if they think we're valuable cargo." Lyra folded her arms. "You want to let them inside?" Arindra met her gaze unflinchingly. "We trap them, disable their ships from the inside." Gideon's mind raced through the implications. It was a dangerous gamble, but it just might work. If they could isolate the enemy teams, take out their leaders, they'd have a chance. "It's a hell of a risk," he said grimly. "Risk is all we have left," Arindra replied, her voice soft but certain. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Lyra drew her blade with a practiced flick, its edge catching the faint light like a promise of violence. "I'll cover the engine bay," she said curtly. "We'll draw them into the lower decks." Gideon nodded. "Arindra, stay close to me. We'll hit them from the bridge and lock down the critical systems." His gaze lingered on her, unwilling to admit how much the thought of leaving her alone unsettled him. She offered a faint, knowing smile. "I won't break." With that, they moved into position, each step measured and purposeful. The hum of the ship's failing systems echoed around them, underscored by the distant whine of approaching thrusters. The enemy was closing in, hungry, relentless, and confident. Minutes later, the starship jolted violently as magnetic docking clamps latched onto its hull. Gideon steadied himself against the console, heart pounding as the ship's security system flashed red. "Breaching in progress." "They're inside." Lyra's voice hissed through the comm. 3 boarding teams, moving toward the cargo bay. "Hold them there as long as you can," Gideon ordered. Suddenly, the bridge door burst open, and 3 armored figures surged inside, weapons drawn. Gideon fired first, dropping one instantly. Arindra moved with surprising speed, her hands glowing with faint, resonant light. A sharp pulse of energy crackled outward, slamming into the nearest hunter and sending him sprawling across the deck. The remaining soldier lunged toward her, but Gideon intercepted with brutal efficiency, driving the butt of his rifle into the attacker's faceplate. The hunter crumpled with a sickening crack. Breathing hard, Gideon scanned the room. Silence returned, heavy and charged. Arindra swayed slightly, her breathing shallow from the exertion. He caught her before she could fall, steadying her against his chest. Her fingers clutched his jacket, gripping it like a lifeline. "You're pushing too hard," he murmured, his voice rough with concern. "I can still fight," she insisted, though her strength was fading fast. For a moment, his hand lingered at her waist, warm and protective. Their eyes met, and the air between them shifted, intimate, unspoken, something neither of them could afford to acknowledge. But the ship groaned beneath them, shattering the fragile moment. Over the comm, Lyra's voice crackled through, strained and desperate. "Gideon, they've broken through. Engine bay compromised. I can't hold them." The line went dead. A chill settled over him as he gently released Arindra, his expression hardening into something fierce and unyielding. "Stay here," he ordered, grabbing his rifle and striding toward the exit. "Gideon?" Arindra reached for him, her voice laced with something dangerously close to pleading. He paused at the doorway, his gaze locking with hers. The connection between them pulsed, sharp and electric, filled with all the things they couldn't say. "I'll come back," he promised, had to, before vanishing into the shadows of the ship's labyrinthine corridors, ready to face whatever waited in the dark. The flickering emergency lights cast harsh, uneven shadows across the narrow corridors as Gideon moved silently through the starship's lower decks. His rifle was steady in his hands, the familiar weight anchoring him against the rising tension coiling in his chest. The faint smell of scorched metal lingered in the air, mixing with the acrid scent of fuel as he tracked the distant sounds of combat. Muffled gunfire, the sharp clang of metal on metal, and the echo of heavy boots pounding against the deck. Lyra was still fighting, but for how long he couldn't be sure. The thought of her cornered and outnumbered gnawed at him, but he pushed it down. Fear wouldn't help now. A sudden crash echoed down the corridor, followed by a strained, mechanical groan as something large collapsed deeper in the ship. Gideon's pulse quickened. He adjusted his grip on the rifle and pressed forward, every step measured, every breath controlled. He reached a junction where the ship's maintenance tunnels converged, pausing to scan the area. Rusting cables and exposed wiring dangled from the ceiling, crackling faintly with residual power. The dim emergency lights flickered again, just long enough for him to spot a faint trail of blood smeared along the metal floor, leading deeper into the maintenance bay. Gideon's jaw clenched. He followed the trail, silent and deliberate, until he rounded a corner and froze. Lyra was there, her back against a shattered bulkhead, breathing hard. Her left arm hung limp at her side, streaked with blood where her armored sleeve had been torn away. Her other hand still gripped her blade, its edge darkened with fresh, burned blood. 3 bodies lay scattered around her, twisted and broken, but more were coming. "Lyra," he hissed, moving toward her. Her head snapped up, her sharp eyes blazing with defiance even through the haze of exhaustion. When she recognized him, her shoulders sagged, just for a moment. A fleeting vulnerability she quickly masked. "Took you long enough?" she growled, forcing herself upright. Gideon was already beside her, his hand steadying her arm despite her attempt to shrug him off. "You're hurt, not dead," she shot back. "I've had worse." Before he could respond, the distant whine of magnetic boots echoed down the corridor. More hunters closing in fast. "We can't hold this position," Gideon muttered, scanning for an escape route. His gaze landed on a maintenance hatch half hidden by debris. "Through there." Lyra nodded tightly, her breathing shallow but controlled. With his help, she forced the hatch open, grimacing as she crawled through the narrow passage. Gideon followed, sealing the hatch behind them just as heavy footfalls thundered into the space they'd abandoned. The maintenance tunnel was dark and stifling, lit only by the faint emergency lights that barely pierced the shadows. They moved carefully, Gideon supporting Lyra when she stumbled, though she stubbornly tried to push him away. "Save it," he said gruffly, tightening his grip on her waist. "You're not walking out of here alone." Lyra snorted faintly, though she didn't resist this time. "Always so noble," she muttered, though there was no venom behind the words. They pressed on, the echo of distant voices fading as they put more distance between themselves and the hunters. The tunnel sloped upward toward the secondary engine bay, a chance at higher ground if they could make it. Finally, they reached a dimly lit maintenance alcove, partially shielded by twisted metal supports. Gideon helped Lyra lower herself onto a battered supply crate, her breath ragged and uneven. He crouched in front of her, gently pulling a med kit from his belt. "Let me see the arm." "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice lacked its usual fire. "Lyra." His tone left no room for argument. With a reluctant sigh, she extended her wounded arm. Blood still seeped from the jagged tear along her bicep, where something sharp had sliced through armor and skin alike. "This'll hurt," he warned, already tearing open a disinfectant patch. "Just do it." His hands moved with practiced precision, cleaning and dressing the wound with firm but careful efficiency. His touch was steady, grounding, a sharp contrast to the brutal reality surrounding them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. "You should have left me," Lyra muttered, breaking the stillness. "I was slowing you down." Gideon's gaze snapped up, fierce and unyielding. "I don't leave people behind." Her eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second. "Stupid, but brave." He allowed himself a faint, grim smile. "I'll take that as a compliment." A faint noise crackled over his comm unit, the familiar hum of the ship's internal systems struggling back online. Arindra's voice came through, strained but clear. "Gideon, do you copy?" His breath caught. Relief hit him like a physical blow. He pressed the comm link. "I'm here. We've lost the lower decks," Arindra reported, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "But I've secured the main reactor. They haven't breached the core yet." Gideon forced himself to breathe, grounding himself in the sound of her voice. "Hold tight. We're coming back." He turned toward Lyra, who was already pushing herself upright despite the obvious pain etched across her features. "Can you fight?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Her lips quirked into something fierce and resolute. "Always." With that, they moved together, pushing back through the narrow maintenance tunnels toward the heart of the ship, toward the only thing worth fighting for. The starship trembled under the relentless barrage from the enemy vessels circling like vultures in the storm-darkened sky. Sparks crackled from exposed conduits along the bridge's shattered walls, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the fractured consoles. Arindra knelt near the central power core interface, her hands trembling as she forced raw energy through the ship's damaged circuits. Her breath hitched with each surge, her reserves dangerously depleted. The faint thrum of the ship's reactor echoed through her, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She felt the old starship struggling against failure, stubborn and defiant, refusing to collapse. It reminded her of someone. "Come on," she whispered, pouring more of her strength into stabilizing the failing systems. Her fingertips glowed faintly with resonant energy, shimmering like dying starlight. "Just hold a little longer." The comm unit crackled, and her heart leapt as Gideon's voice cut through the static. "Arindra, status?" She pressed the comm button with shaking fingers. "Main reactor, holding barely. But the hull's not going to last through another hit." "Stay where you are," he ordered, his voice rough but steady. "We're coming back." Before she could respond, the proximity alarm blared, breaching detected. Her stomach twisted as she turned toward the sealed bulkhead at the far end of the reactor room. They were inside. Arindra staggered to her feet, forcing her exhausted body to move. Her senses stretched outward, seeking the cold, predatory presences beyond the door. They were close, too close. The emergency lights flickered, then dimmed entirely, plunging the room into near darkness. Arindra's breathing quickened, her gaze locking on the entrance as the heavy door hissed and began to slide open with a slow, ominous grind. Before she could react, something surged through the dark. A towering armored figure, weapon raised. She barely had time to dodge, the energy blast scorching the wall where she'd stood a moment earlier. Pain seared through her side as she hit the deck, gasping, but she forced herself up, her hands glowing with faint, resonant light. Her power pulsed in defiant response, though weaker than ever. She couldn't fight them all, not like this. The hunter advanced with mechanical precision, his weapon aimed for a killing blow. A sudden, sharp crack split the air, a single, perfectly placed rifle shot. The armored figure staggered, crumpling to the deck with a metallic thud. A ranger gasped, spinning toward the shadows just as Gideon emerged from the side entrance, his rifle still raised, breath ragged from exertion. Lyra followed close behind, her blade gleaming faintly in the dim emergency lights, her expression fierce despite the blood staining her armor. For a heartbeat, relief surged through Arindra, leaving her momentarily breathless. "Stay down," Gideon barked, already taking aim at the next wave of hunters pouring through the breached entrance. Arindra ducked behind the central power console, clutching her injured side. The scent of scorched metal and smoke thickened as energy blasts lit the room in harsh, blinding flashes. Gideon and Lyra moved like a deadly storm, one precise and calculating, the other fast and brutal. But the enemy kept coming. "Fall back to the core," Gideon shouted, firing another round that dropped a hunter mid-charge. Lyra sliced through the last of the forward attackers with brutal efficiency, then pulled back, breathing hard. "We can't hold this much longer." The ship groaned beneath them, its battered hull shuddering under another external hit. A sharp explosion rocked the reactor room, sending shards of twisted metal raining down from the ceiling. Arindra gasped as the ground buckled beneath her, losing her grip on the console. Before she could fall, Gideon was there, catching her with one strong arm. His hands were rough, steady, grounding her against the chaos. "You're hurt," he growled, his voice tight with concern, leaning into his warmth despite herself. Her fingertips brushed his wrist, lingering just long enough to feel the fierce, protective pulse beneath his skin. "You came back." His gaze locked onto hers, fierce and unyielding. "I promised." Before either could speak again, the sound of heavy footfalls echoed from the corridor beyond the shattered entrance. More hunters, relentless and unstoppable. Lyra wiped blood from her jaw and met Gideon's gaze with grim determination. "We need an exit." "There is no exit," Arindra whispered, feeling the reality settle like iron in her chest. "They won't stop. Not until." Her voice broke, but Gideon's hands tightened around hers, anchoring her before the despair could take hold. "They haven't won yet," he said fiercely. Suddenly, the central power core emitted a faint hum, a flicker of energy pulsing through its fractured frame. Arindra's eyes widened, realization hitting like a lightning strike. "The reactor," she gasped. "It's still connected to the jump drive." "Barely." Lyra's gaze snapped toward the sparking console. "Are you saying? If we overload it?" Arindra continued, already moving despite the pain lancing through her side. "We can force a blind jump anywhere away from here. It'll kill the core," Gideon warned. "And maybe us too." Arindra met his gaze steadily, her voice quiet but resolute. "We're out of choices." For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the three of them, worn, battered, but still fighting. "Do it," Lyra growled. Gideon didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the reactor's main interface while Arindra guided trembling fingers over the glowing control pad, her power pulsing weakly through the ship's broken systems. The distant shouts of approaching hunters grew louder. They were out of time. The reactor's hum deepened, vibrating through the deck as the jump drive's ancient systems reluctantly roared to life. "Hold on," Gideon shouted. With a final, deafening pulse of light, the ship ripped through the fabric of reality, hurling them into the unknown, leaving behind only shattered wreckage and stunned silence in its wake. The starship drifted through the vast, silent void, its battered hull scarred from countless impacts. Faint sparks crackled from broken conduits, the emergency lights casting a soft, flickering glow through the quiet corridors. After the blind jump, only the faint hum of auxiliary systems kept the ship alive, suspended in an unknown starfield, far from hostile space. Gideon stirred first, groaning as he forced himself upright from where he'd collapsed against the central console. His head throbbed, his arms ached, but he was alive. A small miracle in itself. The reactor's last, desperate jump had worked, though at a cost he hadn't yet tallied. His mind snapped back to the others. Heart pounding, he staggered to his feet, scanning the shattered control room until his gaze landed on a familiar figure slumped against the far wall. Irindra, he rasped, stumbling toward her. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he gently touched her shoulder. Her skin felt far too cold, her faintly glowing tattoos dim and lifeless. "Come on," he whispered, his voice rough with desperation. "Stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered, a soft, uneven breath escaping her lips. Slowly, her luminous eyes opened, unfocused but alive. Relief hit him like a crashing wave. "You made it," she murmured, her voice faint but steady. He cupped her face gently, letting his forehead rest against hers, drawing comfort from her presence. "We made it," he whispered. "You held us together." Before she could respond, a sharp clatter echoed from deeper within the ship. Gideon snapped upright, instincts flaring, until Lyra's familiar, defiant silhouette emerged from the maintenance corridor, battered but unbowed. "You look worse than the ship," she growled, though her expression softened when she saw Irindra stirring. Gideon exhaled sharply, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nice to see you too." Lyra rolled her shoulders with a grimace. "Reactor's dead, but the life support stable. For now." Irindra shifted, trying to sit up. Gideon moved instantly, steadying her with one strong arm around her waist, his touch firm but careful. "We can't stay adrift," she whispered, her gaze locking with his. "They'll come. Eventually." He nodded grimly. "We'll figure something out." For a moment, the three of them stood in heavy silence, suspended between survival and an uncertain future. They'd escaped, but barely, and the universe was still out there, vast and relentless. But for the first time, Gideon felt something more than grim resolve. He felt hope. Later, after securing the essential systems and sealing off the most damaged parts of the ship, they gathered near the central living quarters, one of the few sections still intact. The air was still, humming faintly with residual power. Outside, an endless sea of stars stretched into infinity, distant and untouchable. Gideon sat on a worn storage crate, absently running his fingers over the stock of his rifle, though for once, there was no immediate threat pressing against his mind. Across from him, Lyra leaned against the bulkhead, her sharp eyes half-lidded, though the tension in her shoulders hadn't fully eased. Irindra sat nearby, wrapped in a makeshift blanket, her breathing steadier but still weary. Her eyes glimmered faintly in the dim light, reflecting the soft, shifting patterns of her tattoos, no longer pulsing with urgency but flowing in slow, rhythmic waves. The silence between them was strangely peaceful, charged with something deeper than words, built on shared survival, trust hard-earned through fire and blood. Finally, Gideon spoke, his voice low but steady. "We should have died back there." Lyra snorted faintly. "You're welcome." He met her gaze, offering a faint, wry smile. "I'm serious. We shouldn't have made it. But we did." Irindra's voice cut through the quiet, soft but certain. "Because we didn't give up, even when the universe tried to break us." Her words hung in the air like a whispered truth, resonating deeper than Gideon expected. He shifted, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What now?" he asked quietly, his eyes flicking between them. Lyra shrugged, though there was no bitterness in her voice. "We survive. Same as always." Irindra reached out, her fingers brushing against Gideon's hand. A light, searching touch filled with something both tender and fierce. "We build something better," she whispered, her gaze steady and unwavering. For a long moment, Gideon couldn't speak, trapped in the intensity of her gaze, the quiet, undeniable rightness of what she'd said. He turned his hand over, letting her fingers entwine with his, grounding them both in that shared connection. Lyra cleared her throat loudly, smirking faintly. You two are disgustingly sentimental. Arindra's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles. Though she didn't pull away, neither did Gideon. The ship groaned faintly, shifting as its systems cycled through dormant protocols, reminding them that survival was still uncertain, that the universe was still vast and cruel. But for now, in that quiet, fragile space, there was something else. Something that burned brighter than fear or despair. Hope, and the promise of something more. Outside, the endless expanse of stars shimmered, distant but waiting. Together, they would find their place among them.